The date is April 21st, 2012. Chicago White Sox pitcher Philip Humber takes the mound against the Seattle Mariners. It's his second start of the season, coming off of a solid first outing in which he gave up one run over 5 1/3 innings against the Baltimore Orioles, and he was looking to capitalize on that. And for a guy who is already age 29, Philip Humber was quite the journeyman in Major League Baseball, and his career up to that point had been disappointing at best and completely forgettable at worst, which is bizarre because there was a time in which Philip Humber was viewed as a potential ace of the future. He was drafted 3rd overall in the 2004 draft out of Rice University, was a key piece of Rice's 2003 national championship run, and when you go back and look at that roster and just the season they had, that's one of the best college baseball teams of all time, and Humber was obviously a huge reason for that. Drafted by the Mets 3rd overall in 2004, and a lot of people thought he was going to be, one of the best pitchers of his era. Didn't pan out. Was already on his 4th team by the time he got to the south side of Chicago to play for the White Sox. Second season with the White Sox. But in 2011, Humber had probably his only legitimately consistent year. Was anybody going to call him an ace? No, not at all. Strikeout numbers relatively pedestrian, but that's not a particularly easy park to pitch in, and Humber put up a 3.75 ERA in 2011. That's great success, right? The guy was still in his late 20s. Maybe that's something to build on. No, he probably won't be needing to clean out room in his trophy case for any Cy Youngs in the future, but he could be a solid number 3, number 4 starter. And then on this Saturday afternoon, nationally televised game on Fox, Humber was not just magical, Philip Humber was perfect. Let's go back to that summer in 2012 because perfect games are almost kind of a thing of the past at this point. We saw one last year against the Oakland Athletics when Domingo Germán threw a perfect game against them. I think that was the first time in which somebody had a perfect game going where people were like, myself included, actively rooting against him not to do it. If anybody wants to know why, just Google Domingo Germán. You'll find the facts. But in 2012, there were 3 perfect games in a relatively short amount of time. The first of these was Philip Humber. Later on that summer, you had Matt Cain for the San Francisco Giants, the eventual world champions, throwing a perfect game against the Houston Astros. You could argue, just in terms of prolificness, that was the most dominant perfect game ever. He struck out 14, even though Houston was awful at the time. We'll talk about that in just a second. Then obviously later in that summer on the same field where Philip Humber threw his perfect game, you had King Felix Hernandez throwing a perfect game against the Tampa Bay Rays, the high point of a career that featured a lot of high points. I mean, Felix Hernandez was remarkable. And that's kind of what's interesting about this particular period of time where, okay, Felix Hernandez throwing a perfect game, that makes sense. Guy was an ace, Cy Young winner, just a workhorse, 200-plus innings a year for the Mariners. That made sense. Matt Cain, well, it wasn't a super long prime. Matt Cain was really darn good. A guy like that, with the way that he could locate the ball and the way that he could spin the ball, made sense that he would throw a perfect game. And then you had Philip Humber. With no hitters, I think that there can definitely be a lot more luck involved. I mean, it kind of speaks for itself. You can afford to be all over the zone, loud outs. There's been guys who've thrown no hitters who have said, yeah, I had a terrible bullpen, or I didn't even have my best stuff on that particular day. But for the most part, and there are exceptions, to throw a perfect game in Major League Baseball, you need to either be an A-plus pitcher like Randy Johnson was at his prime. I brought up Cain, brought up Felix Hernandez. I think you can even throw the 2 Yankees, David Cohn and David Wells, in there in the 90s when they were really rolling. Or you need to have A-plus stuff. And this is one of those instances where neither really applied to Philip Humber. Now, of course, he was, on this day, perfect. 9 strikeouts over 9 scoreless innings. And while every no-hitter or perfect game kind of has that one defining defensive moment, there really wasn't one in this game. Humber just rolled. There weren't a whole lot of loud outs. Now, keep in mind, this was a period of time where the Mariners' offense was terrible, but you got to throw it out the window. I mean, this is a perfect game that we're talking about. It was a magical start for Humber, and I even remember after his perfect game, he did a press conference afterwards being like, man, I looked at the list of pitchers who've thrown perfect games, and what Philip Humber is doing on that list, I have no idea. He was obviously very humble about it, but I'm always fascinated by what pitchers do after no-hitters and perfect games. If they're ever able to carry that momentum with them. Mark Burley, who is a famous White Sox pitcher, after he threw his perfect game very famously, took another perfect game into the 6th inning in his next start. He ended up taking a loss, but that's a remarkable run. Philip Humber's story is interesting and also mildly tragic because this dude threw a perfect game and dipped. By all accounts, Philip Humber seemed like a great guy. And hey, you know what? He has a piece of baseball history. So let me just try to be nice when I say Philip Humber was a fucking terrible major league pitcher. Did he have business throwing a perfect game? On that particular day, he did. That's kind of what makes baseball amazing, that a guy like that, in the most random of circumstances, can throw a perfect game, but immediately afterwards, he went off the rails. And when I say immediately, I mean immediately. In his first start after his perfect game, he made a start at home against the Boston Red Sox. The Red Sox, keep in mind, finished in last place in 2012. They were a mess under Bobby Valentine. He goes out there, right, guaranteed rate, or what was it at the time? U.S. Cellular at the time. Standing ovation, all the fans showing him love. Wow, what an amazing moment. Welcome back to the park. 5 innings, 8 hits, 9 runs. And he never looked back. By the end of the season, he was getting lit up so consistently that the White Sox ended up moving him to the bullpen, ultimately put up horrific numbers in 2012 before he ended up being shipped to the Houston Astros in 2013. Now, nowadays, or really over the last decade, you hear about a guy getting shipped to the Houston Astros and you say, oh, wow, great success. He's probably going to turn his career around. Look at how many guys they've done that with. People forget, there was a window of time. Now, they were bad for quite a while, but there was probably about a 3-4 year stretch where the Houston Astros were historically terrible. And the apex of that awfulness was the 2013 season, and Philip Humber was one of the reasons for that. Humber ended up putting up a 6.44 ERA in the season where he threw a perfect game. So, rough, but like, you know, room for improvement, right? Like, there's got to be something, you'd think. So he goes to Houston, a Houston team that ended up finishing with the worst record in baseball that year. And Humber, 0-8, 7.90 ERA. He didn't spend a whole lot more time in Major League Baseball, eventually retired. And when you just look at the bare bones baseball reference page, you think that this is just another face in the crowd in Major League Baseball. I mean, his career was remarkably subpar. And I think that unlike any other sport, this is what makes baseball so interesting and so charming, in my opinion. Because Philip Humber, there probably was a time in which this dude could have dealt at the big league level. And things get in the way. Sometimes it's poor player development, sometimes it's injuries, sometimes it's inconsistency, sometimes it's the yips. You never truly know. It is hard to develop a good major league player. It's hard not to screw guys up. There's a reason why number 1 picks and top-rated prospects sometimes make it to the big leagues and don't pan out. These things happen. And yet, for this one magic day in Seattle, Philip Humber was the greatest pitcher in the world. And that can never, ever be taken from him. And while he had that moment and fell off the map fast, I don't think he would trade it. I guarantee you he wouldn't trade it. Because when you look at the list of pitchers who've thrown no-hitters in relatively recent memory, you think of Mark Burley, you think of Roy Halladay, you think of Matt Cain and Felix Hernandez, and yes, in the middle of that list is this unknown pitcher from Rice University, Philip Humber,